Alright, hey guys. We're in Deuteronomy 9 today. Still in Deuteronomy 9. We went back and I kind of went back and just went through some stuff again. I wanted to kind of catch back up on where I had left off before I moved into 10. And towards the end of Deuteronomy, there was several things that had kind of jumped out at me. I would encourage all you guys to, if you're going to read a chapter, at least back up a couple of verses into the previous chapter and figure out where they left off. Remember that all of these books, when they were written basically like letters or historical accounts. They had a flow to them. The chapters and verses were added later on, and they were just added basically for reference so that I could refer to, hey, go to Deuteronomy 9, and you would know what section I was talking about. But originally, when these things were written, they were written just all together, one long letter or one long book, and that's how they were intended to be read. So sometimes what we have a tendency to do is we leave off on a chapter, and then we start the next chapter, and we kind of forget what the tone of everything was, and context is key. So in particular, something that had kind of stood out to me that we had pointed out in the last one was that it wasn't for Israel's righteousness that God had brought them out of the land, that he had done this for his purpose, and to show his mercy and his greatness. And one of the things that really stood out to me was he really made a point, starting in verse 5 and all the way through, really all the way through till about halfway through the chapter, to really point out all the rebellion that they had done. And Moses is saying, look, you did this at Kadesh Barnea, and you did this at Horeb, and he's really making a point to drive home the fact that they were a rebellious people. And he even had this statement to say, which stood out to me. In verse 24, it says, ye have been rebellious against the Lord from the day that I knew you. So from the very day that he knew them, all the way through Egypt, all the way through their 40-year journey in the wilderness, all the way up until now where they're fixing to cross into the land, they've been a rebellious people nonstop. So he really wanted to drive home the point that it wasn't because of their righteousness. And then you get down to verse 28, and the last two verses of the chapter, it says, or we'll back up to 27, it says, remember thy servants. This is Moses, praying to the Lord. Remember thy servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look not unto the stubbornness of this people, nor to their wickedness, nor to their sin, lest the land who brought us out say, and he's talking about Egypt, he said, lest the land whence thou broughtest us out say, because the Lord was not able to bring them into the land which he promised them, and because he hated them, he hath brought them out to slay them in the wilderness. So one of the things that he's really kind of making a point here is when he's praying to the Lord, he's saying, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and don't look on the stubbornness and the wickedness of these people, their children. And really Moses' heart was almost afraid that the Egyptians were going to say, well, the reason why God brought them out of the land was to destroy them because they were a wicked people. And Moses says in verse 29 that that's not the case. He says, yet they are thy people, thine inheritance, which thou broughtest up by thy mighty power and by thy stretched out arm. And he really drives home the point that he brought them out because he could, because it was his grace, it was his sovereign election, it was his choice. The Israelites weren't better, it wasn't anything to do with their own righteousness. And this kind of brings up something, why would God bring just an utterly rebellious people out? And it kind of made me think about Romans 9 and verse 22 and 23. It says, this is Paul talking, and he's explaining in Romans chapter 9 God's sovereign election. And he says in verse 22, "What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction?" So he was like, what if God put up with the most rebellious people? He put up with sin in the world to this degree. What if God endured it for this long just to make his wrath known? But then he also says in verse 23, "And that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared unto glory." So he basically gives a twofold response. He was like, what if God puts up with all this sin and all this evil and the rebelliousness just so that he can show his glory and his power in judgment on those people? But he also says, what if God also endured it that he might show his glory and his mercy on those who he has afore prepared unto glory, those who he has, sovereignly elected. So, and then in verse 24, he clears up any sort of distinction or misunderstanding about whether or not it's just the Jews who are elect. He says, "Even us whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles." So I know these passages have a tendency to rub people the wrong way because there's various different reasons I won't get into, but I would encourage everybody to just read the chapter. Just read Romans 9. Read everything that we've been reading from Genesis all the way up until Deuteronomy at this point. It's really been driven home the fact that God chooses who he chooses, and he hardens who he wills. And that's actually a passage that's in both Exodus 33 and also in Romans 9. So look at that, and let Scripture be your guide, and that should really kind of change and humble your heart. The fact that if God has called you out, that it wasn't because of righteousness that you had done. It's because he had sovereignly elected. I know some people are going to get all butthurt and start screaming Calvinism, but I would encourage anybody to study church history and figure out what it was that Calvin actually taught. Calvin wasn't even around when the 5 points of Calvinism were penned. Prior to Calvin, Luther was around, and Luther preached the sovereignty of God. I mean, this goes all the way back. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the early church fathers had said. It matters what Scripture says. And Scripture just plainly says, whom he had afore prepared unto glory. So I can't explain it. I don't know why. But other than God's mercy, I would still be blinded and would have no relationship with him. So something to think about. So, all right, God bless.